There are nights that pass like any other, and then there are nights that rewrite the course of history. Imagine looking up at a quiet sky only to realize it's been invaded, not by thunderous jets or flashing missiles, but by 728 silent, intelligent machines moving with eerie precision. No declarations, no announcements, just action. This wasn't just an attack, it was a message written in the language of technology and desperation. A message that bypassed every radar and struck straight at the heart of global power. You're not just about to watch another motivational speech, you're about to witness the anatomy of a moment that forced the world to hold its breath. A moment where borders dissolved, silence turned into strategy, and the definition of power was flipped on its head. What you're about to hear is not fiction, it's not drama, it's reality. Raw, bold, and unforgettable. And once you hear it, you won't be able to unhear it. This is not just a speech, it's a front row seat to a revolution in the making. So sit back, breathe deep, and prepare to feel every word, because this one will echo long after it ends. The rise of asymmetric warfare is no longer a prediction, it's a reality stamped into the night sky by the flight of 728 drones. This wasn't a random show of power, it was a message written in the language of modern resistance. Once upon a time, nations needed massive armies, billion-dollar jets, and sprawling bases to be heard. Today, a determined force with a fraction of that budget can paralyze airspace, breach defense systems, and redefine the global balance with machines the size of backpacks. Asymmetric warfare is about leveling the field when the scales have been tipped for too long. It is the answer of the outnumbered, the outgunned, and the unheard. It's not chaos, it's calculated clarity. It doesn't beg for attention, it commands it. And in one night, that command echoed louder than decades of diplomatic posturing and military threats. This drone assault didn't just challenge a military, it challenged an entire system. It exposed a hard truth many global powers ignore. Superiority on paper means nothing if your opponent is fighting with a different kind of intelligence, a different kind of desperation, and a different kind of purpose. Asymmetric warfare is born from imbalance. When you block every door, people find a window. When you silence every voice, they send 1,000 into the sky to speak for them. These drones were not just steel and circuits. They were statements. Each one declared that innovation, strategy, and willpower could now outweigh fleets and fortresses. And the world saw it unfold, not over years, but in one night. This isn't just military evolution, it's revolution. Asymmetric warfare has changed the questions that nations must ask themselves. No longer is it how many tanks do we have, but how prepared are we for ideas we didn't see coming. No longer is it where is the enemy, but what if the battlefield is everywhere. The rise of asymmetric warfare means the old rules are dead, and the ones who once set them are now scrambling to rewrite them. It means that power now lies not in who has the most, it lies in who understands the game has changed. And those who fail to recognize that, well, they just might wake up one day to the sound of 728 truths buzzing above their heads. 728 drones didn't just fly into restricted airspace, they flew straight into the minds of every military analyst, every world leader, and every general who once believed in the comfort of control. This wasn't just warfare, it was psychological warfare played at an entirely new level. You see, conventional attacks create damage, but this created doubt. Doubt in the systems meant to protect, doubt in the superiority long claimed by superpowers, doubt in the very idea of invincibility. Every one of those drones carried more than explosives. They carried fear, unpredictability, and the chilling question, if they can do this, what's next? The air was not just filled with metal, it was filled with message. A message that said, we can reach you, and we will choose the time, the scale, and the silence. Here is a battlefield of its own, and this was a full-scale invasion of the mind. Military strategies were thrown into chaos, defense systems scrambled without warning, and newsrooms across the world tried to make sense of something so coordinated yet so unconventional. This wasn't just an attack, it was theater, psychological theater. It shattered the illusion that might is always visible, that strength only comes with size, because when hundreds of tiny, almost invisible threats rain down in unison, it doesn't just weaken structures, it weakens confidence. That's the real victory of psychological warfare, not the destruction it causes, but the uncertainty it spreads. And uncertainty, once planted, grows fast. It infects strategy, poisons assurance, and forces nations to look over their shoulder, even in peace. The brilliance of this strike wasn't just in the drones, it was in what they represented. They made people realize that the rules of warfare had already changed while the world was still bragging about tanks. They made people realize that an enemy doesn't need to be seen to be effective, and most dangerously, they made people realize that no matter how advanced your systems are, your mind remains the most vulnerable target. The greatest threat now isn't just what hits your radar, it's what gets past it. Not just what you see, but what you can't predict. And in that silence, in that fear, lies the real strike, the one that lasts long after the drones disappear from the sky. The 728 drone strike sent more than just explosive shockwaves. It shattered the very idea that borders still matter in the age of modern conflict. For decades, nations believed geography was their shield. Mountains, oceans, airspace, all were considered lines of protection. But those lines were rewritten in one night. Drones, with their silent flight and coordinated precision, slipped through the cracks of national defense systems and made one thing crystal clear. Invisible borders are just as meaningless as promises of invulnerability. When technology flies beyond terrain, politics, and even radar detection, the question is no longer where are you safe, it becomes are you safe at all? This is the new world, one where war doesn't march in boots or roar in jets. It hums quietly above you, invisible to the eye, unstoppable to the unprepared. The attack proved that distance is no longer a deterrent. A country's capital, no matter how fortified, is now just seconds away from reach. It doesn't matter how many miles stretch between enemies when one person with the right device can cross those miles with a push of a button. The message is cold and undeniable. No one is out of range. Not anymore. In this era, invisible borders also mean invisible threats. Traditional warfare is built on visible warnings. Tanks rolling in, soldiers amassing, fleets deploying. But these drones bypassed all that. They didn't declare war, they just acted. And that's what terrifies every military strategist watching. There were no speeches, no ultimatums, just action. And by the time the world reacted, the strike had already carved this message into the sky. That's power, not in destruction alone, but in the delivery, silent, sudden, and undeniable. What once took armies now takes algorithms. What once needed permission now only needs connection. This is not science fiction. It's the battlefield now. And that battlefield doesn't care about lines on a map. It doesn't respect treaties or titles. It only respects readiness. The countries still thinking conventionally are already behind. And the ones launching 728 drones in one night, they're not just attacking, they're rewriting the very idea of where war begins and where it ends. And in this new era, the battlefield isn't coming, it's already here. It's above you, around you, and in every blind spot you never thought to watch. For generations, air superiority was the crown jewel of global power. It belonged to the select few, nations with massive defense budgets, sprawling air forces, and the luxury to dominate skies with thunderous jets and satellite-guided bombs. But the 728 drone strike shattered that monopoly in a single night. No longer is air dominance reserved for the superpowers. What once required billions of dollars and fleets of elite pilots now demands something far more accessible. Innovation, coordination, and a will that cannot be bought or bombed out of existence. This was the moment when the illusion of exclusive power cracked, and the whole world saw that David didn't just find a stone, he built 728 of them and sent them flying. The attack didn't rely on stealth bombers or high-level military intelligence. It was executed with relatively inexpensive, agile, and intelligent machines that can be built, coded, and deployed outside the borders of traditional military empires. That's what makes it terrifying for those at the top, not just the effectiveness of the drones, but the message they carry. Power is no longer in the hands of the few. It's in the minds of the focused, the hands of the determined, and the hearts of those with something worth fighting for. The game has changed from who has the biggest hammer to who has the sharpest mind, and that terrifies those who spent decades believing they could never be matched. Monopoly on power was always maintained by fear, the fear that challenging it would bring annihilation. But when someone stands up not just to challenge, but to shake the sky with hundreds of coordinated threats, it breaks more than defense systems. It breaks psychological submission. It shows every underdog watching from the shadows that they're no longer helpless spectators, they are players. And some of them are rewriting the rule book with every launch. The drone strike became more than an act of war. It became a declaration that brains can beat budgets, that software can challenge superpowers, that belief, when paired with technology, is more dangerous than any fleet. The old power structures are being outmaneuvered, not by bigger armies, but by smarter strategy. And once that monopoly is broken, once the myth is exposed, there's no putting it back together. That's what makes this moment historic. Not just the drones in the sky, but what they left behind on the ground. The shattered pieces of an old world order that believed itself untouchable. When 728 drones filled the night sky, it wasn't just the sound of engines or the blinking of lights that shook the world. It was the deafening silence that followed from global leaders, not because they didn't notice, but because they didn't know how to respond. That's when it became clear this wasn't just an attack, it was a strategic silence, a power move that spoke volumes without uttering a word. In diplomacy and politics and warfare, silence is often louder than outrage. And in this case, that silence wasn't indifference, it was fear. The kind of fear that forces even the loudest governments to go quiet, to reassess, to calculate before speaking. Because when 728 drones fly through one of the most tightly monitored airspaces in the world and strike with such precision, it tells every nation watching that the game has changed and no one is truly safe anymore. This moment triggered shockwaves, not because of the destruction alone, but because of what it revealed. It exposed vulnerability in intelligence, vulnerability in defense systems, vulnerability in assumptions that have kept powerful nations comfortable for too long. It pulled the curtain back on military pride and showed the world that when new tactics enter the arena, the old ones look outdated and unprepared. And instead of seeing swift, united responses from world powers, what the world saw was a strange quiet, a vacuum, where condemnation should have been, where threats usually fly, where leaders typically scramble to reassure their people. That silence spoke to a deeper truth. The countries who used to dictate the rules are now being forced to read them again, this time from someone else's script. The world watched and waited, but no strong statement came. No retaliation followed immediately, because this was not a conventional threat. It was a psychological one, a reminder that the old guard isn't invincible. And sometimes the most powerful response is to say nothing. because words cannot contain what the mind is still trying to process. The real power behind the drone strike wasn't just in the launch, it was in the aftermath. The stillness, the pause, the hesitation of those who usually don't blink. That's what shook the planet. Because when you silence the loudest rooms without speaking, you've done something more than attack. You've redefined what power sounds like. And sometimes the most terrifying sound in warfare is silence. Beneath the smoke, the noise, and the headlines, there lies a question few are willing to ask. What drives a people to launch 728 drones in one night? What force moves human beings to coordinate such a massive, precise, and dangerous act? The answer doesn't come from strategy books or war rooms. It comes from centuries of pain, oppression, injustice, and broken promises. When you corner a people, strip them of their voice, their dignity, their homes, and their hope, when you ignore their pleas and mock their suffering, eventually they will speak in the only language the world seems to hear, action. And sometimes that action takes flight not to conquer, but to scream through the silence. It becomes a last resort, born not out of cruelty, but of desperation, frustration, and the relentless refusal to die quietly. These drones weren't just launched from bases. They were launched from stories, from funerals filled with children, from hospitals turned to rubble, from treaties that meant nothing and borders drawn in blood. This wasn't a technological marvel. It was a moral outcry. The world watched the result, but few looked at the cause. Few asked what pain had built those wings. Few wondered what injustice had written the code. But behind each machine was a message. We see what you ignore. We feel what you dismiss, and will no longer wait for your permission to matter. The moral question behind this strike is bigger than politics, deeper than defense. It touches the soul of our humanity. Because if this is what it takes for a voice to be heard, then what does that say about the world that refused to listen before? If people must weaponize their pain just to be acknowledged, then silence becomes complicity. And in that silence, injustice becomes emboldened. But this event flipped the script. It forced the world to ask not just what happened, but why. Why would anyone risk such a move, knowing the consequences? Because for some, the consequences of doing nothing are already worse. They live in them every day. This keynote forces us to confront our own comfort, to look beyond the headlines and ask ourselves not just what's right, but what's fair. And if we're brave enough to ask that, we might finally understand that behind every act that shocks the world, there's a pain that's been screaming long before the world ever listened. So now you've heard the story. 728 drones, one night, and a world that blinked. This wasn't just a strike. It was a turning point, a wake-up call wrapped in metal and momentum. It wasn't about destruction alone. It was about disruption. It shattered illusions of safety, of dominance, of superiority that had been sitting comfortably for too long. It reminded every global power watching that warfare has changed, that the battlefield is no longer just land and sky, it's minds, systems, silence, and stories. It told the voiceless that they don't need to scream anymore. They can fly their message across borders. It exposed the cracks in empires and the courage of the outnumbered. This was not just a military move, it was a mirror. And what we saw in it wasn't just strategy, but humanity pushed to its edge, responding in the only way it felt the world would notice. So to every listener, every thinker, every soul that stayed through this story to the end, thank you. Your attention means you're not just consuming history, you're witnessing it. And that matters. May we all learn from this moment. May we all understand the weight behind it. And may we never underestimate the power of what flies, not just above our heads, but straight into our conscience. Good luck. Stay aware. Stay awake. and thank you for listening.